So I want to just welcome everybody. Tonight's topic is offshore in the Gulf of Maine: when, where, why, and how. And really what we wanted to, do tonight is present kind of some basic information, but really try to make sure that we give an opportunity to allow people to ask their questions so that we can formulate any of the next activities from here on in. We ask that folks consider introducing yourself in the chat function, stay muted during the presentation, ask questions in the chat, or let us know you have a question there, and we will call on you. Depending on the number of people we have on the line, we'll either do that just at the end, or if there's something that's critical that comes up and we've got the opportunity, we may do that in the middle. And this presentation will be recorded and made available on our Salem Safe YouTube channel. So we will move to that now. Right. And is the recording going now, Dave?
Yes.
All right, great, thank you. So SAFE presents offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine: when, where, why, and how. And like I said, we're going to try to answer a few questions, but mostly we want to hear the questions that other folks have. And so Pat Kazemba and I are going to be kind of co-presenting this evening, so we'll kind of go back and forth between the slides. So Pat, take it away.
Cindy, I'm going to rely on you to cue me on. Thanks a lot. I think most people probably on this call understand something about Salem's maritime history and the great mark that Salem made on world transport and on world trade in the age of the clipper ships. And in fact, Salem was the most important port in the country up until ships needed deeper draft. And Salem did not have that kind of harbor that would accommodate bigger ships. And the locus of opportunity for nautical pursuits went to Boston. And we've not really recovered that in terms of our harbor, in terms of our port. I remember that when Greenpeace came to town in 2001, and I remember Paul Tucker was the captain of the police then, and he was as surprised as we were surprised when Greenpeace climbed the coal pile. But afterwards, talking with some of the folks from, one of the women from Greenpeace, she said she had been raised in Salem and she had never seen anything like Salem Harbor with all of the boats that were out there. So Salem's interest in the sea and in boating burgeoned in the 20th century. And she said, it almost looks like Marblehead Harbor over here. And indeed, it does, that there's a lot of interest in the ocean, a lot of interest in using the ocean. And that's mostly for pleasure. Of course, the harbor had a function when we were supporting a coal-fired, coal and oil-fired power plant, and big coal ships came into the port and left the coal. We didn't know how damaging that coal and the burning of coal and the burning of oil, the burning, in fact, of any fossil fuel was, until we started getting educated. And that was shortly, I think strict environmentalists back in the 1990s were warning us about climate change, and I think we didn't pay attention. And we've gone 30 years and we really haven't done a whole lot. Yeah, sure, we started banning plastic bags, and we started, and we switched from a coal plant to a gas-fired plant, which was better in terms of the environment. But really, we have not taken that challenge that was laid down to us in 1990 in a serious way. And now we're at 2020 and we're looking at 2050 as like a drop dead deadline, I suppose we could call it, because we know that by 2050, we've got to do something different. And as we've been sort of dragging our heels in terms of pursuing more creative, innovative, cleaner sources of electricity. We can only look to Europe and what Europe has done in the last 20 years in particular, and the thousands of turbines that they have in Europe that are producing clean, renewable energy. And at the time those years, what Europe was doing was leading the way in terms of the technology. They were really the forerunners of everything that developed in terms of offshore wind. And so from our point of view, I suppose we can say, well, the test drive has already been made. You know, we know from what has happened in Europe that offshore wind is going to be a great resource for us in terms of producing energy that's clean. So we're concerned about, as the slide up there says, the National Audubon Society and the National Wildlife Federation came around in support of offshore wind. And that was a struggle. They really took it very seriously. I can remember being on a bird watching trip with Audubon Society, and we were down in Plymouth, and we were not so far from the nuclear power plant. And I was talking with the trip leader, who was an Audubon employee, and I said, you know, it makes me sad to think that here we are, we're by this nuclear power plant, and we should be thinking about offshore wind. And Audubon has not really come out in support of Cape Wind. And she said, well, we're really taking it very seriously. We're looking at bird migration patterns, et cetera. And we want to be sure that we're not doing anything that's damaging to the environment. And, you know, I was a little bit irked at the time. I have to say I was impatient. I wanted something different to happen. But I stuck with Audubon because I believe in Audubon, and I believe in how seriously they take their environmental stewardship. And when we started exploring offshore wind, the first thing I heard was a talk that was going to be up in the Topsfield Public Library, and it was a woman named Amber Hewitt. And Amber Hewitt has become a kind of guiding light for us, from that little talk up in the library up in Topsfield that I didn't make, but I think maybe one person on this call, Jim Malloy, told me that I think maybe he made that call, or that talk, or at least he knew about Amber and knew about her talking about it. Yeah, Jim says yup in the chat. So when National Audubon Society came out in favor of offshore wind, and then when I saw that National Wildlife Federation was in support of offshore wind, then I thought, we've got really a lot of solid footing now in the environmental community with these two giants of environmental concerns coming out in support. The difference between Cape wind and the kind of offshore wind that we're talking about here today is quite different, because Cape wind and vineyard wind even are in an area of the seabed that is much shallower. And what we're looking, and they're going to develop that. All those leases are sold. There's going to be an enormous amount of energy coming from Nantucket Sound, and that's a great thing. But the kinds of, and they're going to be further out. They're going to be away from the out of the view shed too. They'll be about 14 miles out at sea. So we're talking about a very little turbine on the horizon. And only those of us who are offshore wind enthusiasts are going to be really, really excited about taking a ferry out to Nantucket and seeing them perhaps at a closer view. So we're going to be talking tonight a little bit about deep water turbines and that technology. Just as offshore wind that was affixed to the seabed got pioneered over in Europe and proved, now deep water turbines are getting proved. It's as if Europe is our testing ground for offshore wind. So let's go to the next slide. These are the challenges that we've got in front of us. You know, getting to a cleaner sources of energy and curbing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's no question about it. that as we look at what are the solutions to make us get to net zero by 2050, offshore wind is the big resource that we have. It's the lever that we can pull that will get us the most gains in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So with offshore wind, we get to address the climate, reduce our emissions, thereby addressing the climate crisis, meeting our energy needs, and growing our economy. And what's great about that is that it all happens simultaneously. With offshore wind, we'll be reducing the emissions, we'll be addressing the climate crisis, we'll be meeting our energy needs, we'll be growing our economy, and as part of growing our economy, we'll be really giving opportunities for jobs in a clean industry that we hope will be good paying jobs. And the Biden administration has not been shy about saying that they want good union jobs to be part of the offshore wind array of choices that are out there. So, okay. Cindy, you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Pat. So, so as you saw, not only do we have the federal government and Massachusetts plans for climate reduction, but obviously, Maine and New Hampshire are right there too. So even though you really hear a lot about the South Shore developments, the reason that we're talking about Gulf of Maine here is that there will be more developments going northbound as well, because that's how those states are going to need to be able to try to meet their goals as well. And when you look at the wind resource map here on the left, the really bright red and a little bit of blue that you may see is the strongest wind resources that are mapped. And those are right off of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine coasts. So the problem is that the South Shore is a little bit shallower, so it's certainly a lot easier to start there. And so that's what we're seeing happening. And if you look at overall where the states have, how much wind resources each of the states have on the right-hand side graph, you'll see that Massachusetts actually has the most wind potential of all of the states in the United States. So it makes sense that we had kind of started on the program, right, with Cape Wind in that attempt. And yet we are starting to definitely lag behind. New York and New Jersey are really outstripping us from that perspective. They are really upping their pace and starting development a lot. And so, so one of the things that you'll notice on that graph too, on the right-hand side, is that the water depth, it does start getting deeper off of our coast. And so a lot of that potential is in deeper water. And so that's been, one of the other things that holds us back a little bit. But as Pat mentioned, that technology is coming along. And so, this has always been kind of a long-term strategy. It's not something that's going to happen right away. A lot of different things have to fall into place. But if we don't plan for that now, because so many things need to come in place and kind of link together, there has to be a lot of planning that goes into that to make sure that it can happen. So
may I just add at this point, yeah, Cindy, about that? I wanted to say that, a lot of folks are approaching offshore wind and feeling as if they're overwhelmed and they don't really understand it. And I want to say that those of us in SAFE, many of us, and I certainly put myself there as a former English professor, that I'm learning as I go. And it's very exciting to be learning about this. And that SAFE we have connected ourselves, and a number of people on this call are connected with New England for Offshore Wind, and and we're learning from this coalition of folks in the New England states what they are doing in the other states, and how we can produce kind of synergies in terms of our support for offshore wind. And in that coalition of New England for Offshore Wind, we have environmental organizations, we have justice organizations, because we're very concerned about not making this something that goes forward for white rich people. We want everybody to be part of this. So we want opportunities for jobs, we want opportunities for investment, and we want to see justice as a key element of everything that we do about offshore wind. So we're hooked with environmental and justice organizations. We're hooked up with academic and research institutions in New England for offshore wind, and with business alliances. The business alliances are part of this as well, and labor unions. And labor unions are a key part, because I think they will help us keep the justice issue at the forefront. So Cindy, let's go back to the waters and questions about that.
Yeah, so kind of one of
What
our
did you-
first questions, right, is where? So where are we talking when we
Yeah.
talk Gulf of Maine, and where are we talking that the turbines might be? So way back when we used to talk about offshore wind, we were talking about in state waters when Massachusetts first started talking about offshore. And so this is a fairly old map, and where some of the initial wind resources areas were. So there had been a wind resource designated kind of right in the harbor of the Cape. There was one right off of our shores, partly because there was some interest up in the Salem area that had been voiced. And then there was, and this is Massachusetts specific, so there was another one up in this area. Since then, the state really has kind of gotten out of the business of having offshore wind in state waters, partly due to Cape Wind, and realizing that, when things were closer and in the viewshed, that wasn't as desirable. But also because the federal government kind of finally started getting their act together and saying, okay, we will figure out how to do lease areas, et cetera. And this is a really kind of fuzzy picture, because I snipped it and then blew it up to make it a little bit larger. But so these offshore wind turbines, when we're talking offshore wind these days, it would all be, out of this, out in this area between the red line around the coast, and then this kind of more black line out here, and that's the federal water areas that it would be designated. So that gives you an idea. So they're quite far offshore in any of the areas that they might possibly get designated. And then, to do a little bit more, again, right now, this is what the South Shore is looking like, and further down the coast. There's a lot of different wind areas being designated. And this is kind of what happens is the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management sets aside, some specific areas they designate, and then they put those out to bid. And then the developers come in, bid on that area, and then they decide kind of what their final proposal might be of how they're going to use that area. And then they go for permits, et cetera. So there have not been any areas designated yet north of the Cape. That is in a new organization, a new part of a BOEM group for a tri-state group that's North Mass, New Hampshire, and Maine combined. So while, so there is, again, a lot of discussion about South Shore, that does not mean that it won't happen eventually north as well. And in fact, if you look at the picture here on the right-hand side, you'll see that, there's even, already they're starting to work on, concepts of what the transmission lines are that they want to put in through the Gulf of Maine, all the way up to the Bay of Fundy. And so this would ultimately be like a spine as different things kind of connect into it. So if they're starting to plan this, then don't think that it's not going to happen eventually north, right? I think the next one's Pat.
So this is a great illustration that Cindy's put up of where of the kinds of floating turbines that we're talking about. And again, as I said, Europe is our test lab, and we're learning a lot. We're learning a lot from them. So this is not, we do have some experience with this kind of floating technology, because if you look back down to oil rigs, gas rigs that are offshore, this is essentially a same kind of concept. You say, well, how can some floating how can these floating platforms really sustain these huge machines that weigh so much and have so much motion? Well, that's been going on in the Gulf of Mexico, and there were some disasters there, that's for sure. We learned from them, but this is a different thing. This is not like getting oil or gas from the ocean bed. This is really just capturing the wind and producing energy from the wind. So this deep water technology is, as I said, it's evolving. Things are going quickly. Some of us just came off the Salem Harbor Port Authority talk and meeting, and where they were talking about how there's people who know a lot about oceans and ports, et cetera, were talking about how mind-blowing it has been in the last 6 months to see offshore wind move on the trajectory that it is moving on. So there'll be needs for more development of wind technology. Who knows? Maybe there's space at the site by the Salem Harbor Port, the Footprint site currently owned by Footprint, for blade manufacturing, some kind of manufacturing that possibly could happen there. We need to look for funds to shore up our port, to make our port really acceptable to something like the offshore wind industry. And that was part of our discussion in this last Salem Harbor Port Authority meeting that happened at 5 o'clock, which was the discussion focused on, is the land that's there that belongs to Footprint now capable of supporting the technology of moving heavy equipment around that 22 acres. Let's see. We want to find out what the load-bearing capacities are of that port, of that site there, and then go from there. Workforce training, supply chain development, all of this will be a means of getting more people into this industry and getting more people involved in what I find totally exciting, and I find the environmental aspects of it much more exciting than I find the economic aspects. But the economic aspect that I do find really exciting is that it opens up the possibility for jobs for lots of people. We'll need transmission upgrades at Salem. One of the benefits that we got in the community benefits agreement was that Footprint, when it signed this community benefits agreement with the city, agreed to set aside land for landing the energy from offshore, the power from offshore, because we have a substation right there at the Salem site. But as Cindy showed you in that last slide, already I think they are thinking, the offshore wind transmission folks are thinking bigger, and they are looking at Brayton. But who knows? I think we have to keep all our options open. We have to keep all the desirable aspects of our facility here in Salem open. Okay, anything else you'd add about that, Cindy?
No, I think just to point out, like, this is what I was saying about, there's just so many different pieces that need to all grow and come into place so that these can all actually work together to make this type of transition happen. And so again, it's not a short game. There's a lot to be done, but it's a huge, it's potentially a huge economic driver, not only kind of just, yes, this will happen in the US, but really in our region. There's a kind of some amazing opportunities. So this was just a little bit more about kind of the when, and I really already kind of brought you through these steps. But so the tri-state BOEM group will be meeting more to talk about designating areas, and then like I said, then those get bidded on. Proposals, there's environmental reviews that need to go through both at a federal and often a state level as well. There's multiple permitting processes that need to go through and before you then finally get to construction. The estimate for the potential timeline that we saw in Mass CEC's Lloyd's Register draft report that was given to the Salem Harbor Port Authority, which if you haven't seen it, I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. It's on the salem.com website under the Salem Harbor Port Authority. That is estimating that the Gulf of Maine activities might happen within 5 to 10 years. And I would say that just as a note, that was prior to the administration change in the federal government, which was really slowing a lot of this down. And that has been accelerated so dramatically that I would hazard a guess that we're looking now more at the 5-year time frame than the 10-year time frame. So, and then Pat, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. As Cindy pointed out, what Jay Borkland from Lloyd's Registry pointed out to us when he showed us this slide for the first time was that Salem was ideal for numbers of different uses in terms of the offshore wind industry. That Salem's port, there were operations and maintenance possibilities there, that there were manufacturing possibilities, and that there was a possibility for marshaling wind turbines. Actually the poles, that the towers that they are mounted on, and Salem's port is particularly terrific for all of this, because unlike down in New Bedford, and we fully support having New Bedford go forward, and we fully support the use of the Brayton Point facility for the transmission lines. And Cindy already showed you that when transmission folks are looking at where they're going to bring the power down from the Gulf of Maine, they certainly bypassed Salem and they went right to Brayton Point. We'll have to explore what the problems are with Salem, and why Brayton Point looks so much more desirable, and the connection to the grid there looks so much more desirable than the connection to the grid in Salem looks. And the Salem, we've been told that the Salem substation seriously needs an upgrade. We're not as bad as Texas, but we seriously need some upgrades to that National Grid substation that's on the that's in the site area. It's not part of the footprint property. National Grid owns that site. So the big plus for us is, it says on the slide there are no obstructions coming out of the harbor. If they were marshaling, if an offshore wind entity were marshaling, putting up the poles for taking them out to sea to mount turbines on, then there would be no problem with overhead wires, bridges, anything like that. And they have problems. They have challenges like that down there in New Bedford. As Cindy pointed out to me when we were looking at the maps, she was calling up the Google Maps, and we were Google Maps of a Google map of New Bedford, and we were looking at the kind of berth area that ships had coming into the new marine terminal in New Bedford. Cindy was like, whoa, they've got to come in, they've got to go through these gyrations, and they've got the turning basin there in New Bedford is not what it could be, and to make it really easy. So there's pluses and minuses, but this is the kind of thing we're trying to figure out cooperatively with our allies in the New England for offshore wind. we're not competing with New Bedford. The offshore wind industry tells us there's enough business that for Salem and New Bedford and many other ports to support this industry that will go along the Atlantic seaboard. So we fully support what's going on in New Bedford. We fully support Vineyard Wind. We're thrilled. We're waiting expectantly for Vineyard Wind's final approval to be given. And then they'll start on Revolution Wind, which is another wind farm out there in Nantucket Sound. The last point on the slide here about the power plant shutdown date in 2050 is really important for us to think about. I mentioned earlier that 1/3 of the fossil fuel production of energy in Massachusetts is going to be going away by the end of this decade. So 1/3 of that production will go away. And this is just at a point when we need more, we'll be needing more electricity, because we're trying to do our part. We're buying electric cars. We're promoting geothermal microgrids as an alternative to burning gas or burning oil to heat your home. So how do we balance off that? I mean, how would I feel? I would not feel so thrilled. Let me put it this way. I would feel more thrilled if the electricity that was charging the electric car that we bought last year was coming from offshore wind than it were coming from than now, as it is coming from a gas-fired power plant or some fossil fuel power plant in the area. So we got to keep in mind that that power plant at the footprint site will be closing by 2050. That was an agreement that Footprint signed with Conservation Law Foundation before it got its final approval from the Energy Facilities Siting Board, from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, from the Massachusetts DEP. We need to make sure that that is something that is going to happen. It's going to go forward. I just was looking at the chat, and Jeff Cohen mentioned, and I think it's really great that he mentioned it, that offshore wind is not the only renewable energy that we're counting on. We're also counting on solar, and we're counting on hydropower as well. Although we would like to use less hydropower, because much of it is devastating lands of Native peoples up in Canada. And that's a thing we've got to really consider every step of the way. You know, are we getting renewable energy at the expense of some other people? And I hope that we're not going to be getting it at the expense of Native people or other people in Canada or other places. Cindy, I see you popped up the YouTube video. Do you want to maybe play that? And this is really very interesting, because this little video, 1 minute video, is going to show you how the gas-fired power plant got built in Salem, how the turbines were brought there. And as Cindy and I both looked at this video for the first time, actually we looked at it separately, and we both said, wow, this looks like what I imagined would be going on with offshore wind operations over there on that same site. And considerations of, you know, will the land, considerations of whether the load bearing capacity of that land is sufficient to deal with offshore wind are certainly important, and we've certainly got to have that tested out. But right now, let's take a look at this, and then we'll talk about it after we look at this 1 minute video.
All right, so I'm going to click on this. I may have to reshare. We'll see. So
okay, we'll pray for technology to work.
It worked the other night when we tried it. So
yeah,
maybe. Yeah, I'm going to have to reshare.
Okay.
Hold on.
while Cindy's futzing around with that, and I'm sure she'll
Yeah.
get it up because she did
I'll
it
get it there in a second.
the last time. I want to just recap a little bit of what we were saying about the desirability of Salem. First of all, from the maps we showed you, clearly we have a great wind source in the Gulf of Maine. You ready to go, Cindy? And should I stop treading water here?
I
Yeah.
think kind of, sort of.
Okay. This little video is, and I want to ask the people who live in Salem, and particularly the people who live close to the power plant site, you'll recognize the power plant there. Did you hear any of this? Were you aware of any of this while it was happening? And I have to say, I was not aware that this was happening over there. I mean, it's a large scale industrial operation that you see happening right at the site that we're talking about as the site where we would like to see operations for offshore wind happening. So these are huge, huge turbines. These are the turbines that are in the power plant, powering the gas-fired power plant right now. And this is the kind of operation that when we looked at it, Cindy and I both thought, wow, this kind of looks like what we imagined wind operations might look like over there. And it's not exact, but of course it gives you some sense of what industrial functions might look like on that particular site. Huh. So we've got 40 acres, as 40 plus acres, as Cindy points out. We've got a lot of wind. We've got a proven technology that Europe continues to prove to us, and that they are they're on a foray ahead with floating turbines. The other thing is that we know that the cost of putting up offshore wind farms is going down. And this is really important as the prices of fossil fuels continue to go up and remain unstable. The nice thing about wind is it's going to remain stable. The pricing of the wind is going to remain stable, but we know that that's not the case with gas for sure. And we're really looking at uses of development of wind, of uses of our ocean that are compatible with what we like the ocean for. The uses that we find important out there for boating and for fishing in particular, and that's really important. Do you want to talk about this one, Cindy?
Sure. Again, this is just, highlighting some of that economic engine. So again, with port development, supply chain, workforce development, and then, the actual building and installing, and then the long-term operation and maintenance. There's, not only Salem, but other ports in our region all have, possibilities for some of this activity. And certainly, some folks are already getting trained. We know that some of the folks in Gloucester are already starting to get trained to be able to assist with that. And, there's a lot of, headlines out there of different development. And you're seeing, multi-billion-dollar offshore wind plan targets for ports, training and education grants. They're talking about 108% growth rate for these types of activities. And, partnerships with multiple organizations looking at, what all of this is going to mean. So there's a lot of opportunity for our region.
I think I just add one other thing, that in the last meeting that some of us were at 5 o'clock today, Bob Blair, who is the pilot for this Salem Harbor, mentioned that there are all kinds of large federal grants that are available for small ports to improve their ports, improve the infrastructure of their ports to make them suitable for the offshore wind industry. And we talked about, and SAFE has been talking about, we've got to make approaches to Seth Moulton, our congressman, Senator Ed Markey, who is a big wind enthusiast, and Elizabeth Warren, who is all about jobs and all about in economic justice and environmental justice. And I think that we have a Massachusetts legislative delegation that is very much in favor of the kinds of visions we have for what can happen with this industry. I'll just give a couple of economic points at the end here, and then we can get into questions and have some dialogue with folks out there. But we know
hey, Pat, maybe you want to let Paul jump in. He's got to leave. He put a message in the
thanks,
chat.
Jim. You want to bid aloha to us, Paul?
Yes, thank you, Pat, and thank you. I think that was Jim saw that. Thank you. I've got a family obligation at 7:15. My daughter and future son-in-law both started new jobs yesterday, and we're taking them out for a bite to eat. But I did want to catch up. I had 4 real quick updates. Senator Lovely and I met with the folks in the Clean Energy Center a couple of weeks ago, had a fabulous meeting. The director is a guy named Bruce Carlisle, who was fabulous. And they couldn't say enough about the potential in Salem for all the reasons that you cited, the deep water, the no overhead obstructions. I wrote down, I've got some notes from it, and Bruce said Salem checks all of the boxes, and it's at the top. They said they couldn't script a better location. Interesting, tomorrow I got an email from a guy I know. He runs a photography studio, him and his wife on Derby Street, and they do a lot of work with drones. I'm meeting him tomorrow morning. He has a drone presentation and he's a big offshore wind person that he wants me to see and see if I can use this to help make further presentations. I'll let you know more about that. The mayor and Joan Lovely and I actually scheduled a meeting today specifically on the topic of offshore wind and the potential here. I want to leave everybody with the impression this is a front burner issue. This is talked about at the highest levels. I'm not sure if anybody has seen Speaker Mariano's commentary in the papers over the last couple of weeks. I've known the speaker since I've been up there, and I've never even heard him talk about offshore wind. In the last few weeks, he has been right out front. So this is becoming a priority, and I can tell you, we're going to have a lot of friends in the in our delegation at the legislature. So very good news. I appreciate what everybody's doing. Pat, Cindy, and everyone. Jim, everybody, thank you so much for what you're doing. I'll keep you posted, and I think more good news ahead.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks for your advocacy with Speaker Mariano. A number of us were kind of crestfallen when we saw an article that came out in the Boston Globe quoting Speaker Mariano as saying, we're going to really focus on the South Coast and offshore wind down there. And we were kind of like, whoa, what about the North Shore? And what about up here? And it's great that you're reminding him about the North Shore, and that the Mass CEC is confirming that this is a great place for thinking about the offshore wind industry. And with your advocacy, this will be great. This will be great.
Yeah. And Senator Lovely's been awesome as well. She had a lot more knowledge about the DPA designations than I did. And frankly, I've learned quite a bit from her over the last several months. So all good news, and thanks everybody. And thank you for the nice comments in the chat. This is where we're all in this together. So we'll keep moving ahead. So thanks everybody. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye. I just thought I'd interject one more comment about money and economics in terms of all of this. And a lot of us are deeply opposed to fracking. Any of us who are environmentalists are deeply opposed to fracking. And I wanted to just share with you a number that I learned today. And it is that $22 billion in Massachusetts is spent every year on fossil fuels. And 18 billion of that 22 billion goes out of state. It goes to Pennsylvania and South Dakota, where they are doing the fracking. And I think that's a sobering kind of thought. if we invest in offshore wind, we're investing in ourselves. We're investing in the New England region. We're investing in Massachusetts. We're not supporting fracking in Pennsylvania and in South Dakota. And I think that's a really important point. And wind energy, the cost of putting up wind farms is declining. The cost, as I said before, the cost of fossil fuels is going up. So in the not too distant future, I mean, wind is going to be so much cheaper than fossil fuels. And that's what we've got to be thinking about the future. What worried me when I saw the presentation that Footprint was doing was that we were going, in Salem, we appeared to be, if we went with the Footprint proposal, going with the short-term solution, going right to, okay, let's put up housing there and let's put up some little restaurants and other things there as well. But that was not only going to threaten our DPA, but it was going to have that site linked to housing for at least 50 years. Because if you put up condos there, it's going to be there for at least 50 years. So we've got to be thinking further out and realize that we're moving more closely towards the future now that we have this new administration. So we're interested in people's comments, and I haven't been looking at the chat. Cindy, have you seen questions in the chat that you want to address or you want to have people speak about?
Well, I guess there are a couple of questions there, some that are just about the presentation of the slides and some that are a little bit more far-reaching. So I will say again up front that we're not necessarily going to have all the answers to everything, but the whole point was for us to find out what questions people have so that we can help facilitate getting those answers in one way or another, whether that's getting an answer back directly to somebody or whether that's hosting a speaker or whether that's asking some of our elected officials to host a question and answer session, et cetera. So but we've been trying to figure out how best SAFE can serve this ongoing dialogue. And so we really want to hear from folks. And so I know that one of the questions that Karen just asked, which is a good one that I don't know that we have the answer for, is how many jobs could this kind of wind development create specifically for Salem? And I think part of that question still is going to be what type of activity would happen in Salem, but and then trying to get those jobs. I do think some of that is in that presentation that draft report from Lloyd's, but I don't have that information at my fingertips at the moment, but we can get that answer back in more detail.
One of the reasons
but it's a real good question.
One of the reasons I'm interested in that, Cindy, is not so much to have a hard, firm answer about it, but I think that it's an argument that we could articulate well if we had a sense of, this type of development would be this kind of jobs, that, the kinds of jobs that pay for those jobs and everything. I think that could really turn the tide in favor of doing this sort of thing. Agreed.
I do think that's an answer that we can get, as I said, from our allies in New England for offshore wind. And I wanted to give a nod also to Jim Malloy, who is a member of SAFE, but he's also a great leader in 350 and Citizens Climate Lobby. Jim also is a member of New England for offshore wind, but we can get answers from New England for offshore wind about projections because we have sitting in New England for offshore wind labor, a right-hand person to the president of the AFL-CIO in Massachusetts, and the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a labor environmental alliance, also is really important in terms of talking to us about jobs. And I want to give a shout out to Gloucester, because Gloucester, Gloucester Fishermen's Wives were on the cutting edge and got in on a mass CEC grant, and they got funding to train Gloucester fishermen for the offshore wind industry. And I think that what they're going ahead doing is training more people to get captain's licenses to be able to captain the ships, the boats that would be used to support offshore wind. So these opportunities are out there, and we applaud folks from Gloucester who went ahead and got that grant and began training people there. Any other questions, Cindy? I'll look through too.
Well, there's several comments regarding you know, that the job opportunities could offer a possibility for fossil industry folks to transition to the renewable industry, and that hopefully, you know, they'd be union jobs, which so far there's been a, you know, quite a large push to ensure that not only are they union jobs, but they're also equitable, both from a you know, environmental justice perspective, or racial equity, and you know, male-female equity as well. I mean, I'm really seeing actually some real specific grants that are targeting trying to get women into this field specifically, which is interesting. And Bob Blair commented also that, you know, if we were to look at turbine assembly and blade manufacturing, that there certainly would be lots of jobs created associated with those, even more so than you know, some of the marshaling or some of the operation and maintenance. And, you know, each one of these things has different timeframes and different job requirements and different numbers, I think. So we can pull that information together.
There's a question in the chat from Susan Yokelson about how is the Harbor Committee. There's two Harbor Committees that are operating, Susan, and all. The Harbor Plan Update Committee and the Salem Harbor Port Authority. And the Salem Harbor Port Authority is very open, very supportive of offshore wind. We just had a good meeting, and we feel that there is an openness. Mayor Driscoll has had meetings with folks, some folks on this call lobbying about offshore wind, and also with state officials. We have we're also aware that the Environmental League of Massachusetts, which is the sponsor of New England for Offshore Wind, that they also met with Mayor Driscoll. So we're going there, and people, Bob Blair in particular, the Salem Harbor pilot, was pushing today that we've got to get and Stan Franzine, Safe Vice Chair on the Salem Harbor Port Authority, was pushing that we've got to get to Congressman Moulton, we've got to get to Senator Markey, we've got to get to Senator Warren, and tell them that this is something we really want to have happen in Salem. And I think it will, and there is a need for this as well. Ted Warren noted in it that we need many more vineyard wind farms many more vineyard wind farms to meet the energy needs. And it's not as if, you know, the few wind farms that go up in Nantucket Sound and south in New York and New Jersey, they're not going to be enough. We really are going to be, we really are pressed to do more.
One of the other things that I know came up at the Salem Harbor Port Authority meeting today, and Bob Blair also just, you know, said it in the chat, is that one of the big pieces for our port development, as we consider, you know, what this port might have for possibilities, is understanding the geotech and the site loading capabilities. And certainly, you know, there's, you know, I will say, if you just Google New Bedford and you Google Portsmouth, Maine, not Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Those are two of the sites that have been or are under development, and you see kind of how circuitous a route folks would need to go to get into them, as well as Brayton actually as well. You know, so some of the ones that have already been picked seem like, you know, you kind of scratch your head compared to Salem as to why those are being developed versus us. And then, you know, on top of that, you know, I certainly heard, and others may have heard, concerns about, pile driving and ways to, compaction and things that might be needed for the Salem Harbor site. And yes, that's possible, but certainly if you're comparing it to New Bedford, they did a whole fill operation that they then had to compact. This site is already there. It was withholding, tons and tons and tons of coal pile for years. It's pretty compacted. So there's a possibility we might need a little bit more, but I would encourage you not to be too afraid of that possibility. It's not like the development that had to happen at New Bedford. It's a very different animal up here. It's already developed, and it's more. As when I look at it, I'm assuming at least, and granted, I don't know everything about it, that it's a little bit more tweaking of our site than building a whole new site. And so that looks very different.
Yeah. And I think Bob Blair also mentioned in the chat that we need to get the geotech survey of that site, so that we can have somebody actually do a geotech survey of the site, so we can know what the load bearing capacity is of it. Now, some geotech survey was done of the site as it became clear in the Port Authority meeting that we were just at. That happened when Footprint was preparing the site for the power plant, and they needed to understand load bearing capacity, both to bring those huge turbines that you saw in that little video, those huge turbines across that site. And also they were driving piles, lots of piles, and it was a little annoying, I must say, when it was happening, but that was to support the turbines in a power plant that were constantly on and had moving parts. So we need geotech surveys that are clear, and the surveys that have been done so far on that site, as we learned in the last meeting, were mostly to test for environmental pollutions and environmental pollution in the site, and not necessarily for load bearing. So we're going to have to look at all of that. Before I requested that information at the last Salem Harbor Port Authority meeting, Seth Luttrell got it from Footprint, and he shared it with me. And the next people that I'm going to share it with are people from New England for Offshore Wind, and ask them, what does this tell you about the readiness of this site, and what else do we need to get done? And I take what Bob Blair said here very seriously, that when he talks to wind entities, the first question they ask is about load bearing capacity. So I think that's really important. I want to shift to a less technical question, but one that has a kind of myth that I would like to scotch from the very beginning. And that is Tricia Arrington mentioned that when she went on a tour of the Footprint site, a question was asked about how long the site would be used for offshore wind. And the person, Tricia, I'm quoting, and she may want to clarify, the person who was leading the tour said they thought for 10 years. Well, I think that I've heard that. That's the third time I've heard that. And I want to say that if we're talking about building wind farms, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's more, depending on how many wind farms need to get built and how many we can get off the drawing boards and out into the ocean. So the marshaling, possibly in 10 years it will be finished. But there are other needs for offshore wind that site will be using into the future, and that is for operations and maintenance. These turbines need to be serviced. There will be boats, ships going out from our port, I hope one day, that will take care of the operations and maintenance of that. Of those offshore wind turbines. But also, if we get into manufacturing, like you see up there on the screen, one half of a turbine display, the blade display, that if we get into blade manufacturing, that might be something that would last much longer than the 10 years. But I think 10 years is a figure that is a number that we've got to really get off of the tongues of people. It's not going to be like 10 years of offshore wind and then we're all done. It's going to be a much longer time frame. So
yeah, I mean, they'll be continued, and the operation and maintenance, I think that there is some thought that that's just a boat going out and coming back and, making sure that it's, oiled or whatever, right? Like, I think that's the perception, right? And I think that, the scenario is that, certain, parts do fail, parts need to be replaced. And some of those are awfully big parts, right? So it's not like I'm just going to go out with a screwdriver and go handle that. Some of what they're looking at with many of these deep water turbine setups is actually floating them all the way back, right? Fixing them. Is it going to be a lot? They're going to have to weigh what's more economical to bring a boat out there and service it at the location, but the boat's still got to bring the parts, right? And so those parts still could get staged at Salem or other ports similar. Or is it better to bring the whole floating turbine back and do it on land? And a lot of that's going to depend on how many boats are available to do different types of surfacing, which is a whole, the vessels themselves are a whole nother economic development issue in the U.S., particularly since we also want them to be U.S. badged, right? So there's multiple aspects of that, and so I think the 10 years is not likely to be a true number, depending on what activity is looking at and what the technologies are ultimately that get installed.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think too that at this particular moment, what we really need to do is build political will. And I think that our delegation, certainly Paul Tucker and Senator Joan Lovely, are behind this. We want to we've got to push it to the next level, the federal level, and we've got to get our congressmen involved in this, and we've got to get our U.S. senators involved in this as well, advocating. So I think there's a lot. We've got to push Salem. The South Shore, South Coast has a great boost up. They've got Senator Mariano, who is talking about the South Shore. He's from Quincy. They've got Representative Pat Haddad, who is the second in command in the House. She is a very forceful woman who calls herself now the Witch of the Wind. She is very high, and she gave herself that name. She didn't have it foisted on her. So I think that we need to get our political representatives being as enthusiastic as the South Shore has managed to get their political representatives enthusiastic about what's happening. I'm looking at what Ted Warren is saying, and he says, each wind farm has at least 25 years of operations and maintenance. Then we will need new ones to replace the retired ones. Well, there's a thought. Yeah, it's not just that. We're not going to use offshore wind for 25 years. We're going to be using it in perpetuity, we hope. And yeah, it's a longer game that we're thinking about. You got other questions here, Cindy? Or anybody want to speak?
Bob looks like he
Yeah,
wants to here. I'm gonna ask you to unmute there, Bob. There you go.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, the state, the rhetoric at the political level is heated up, and there's a lot of focus on the ports that are, in Buzzards Bay. And there's very little focus on the ports north of Boston. And I really think that's a marketing problem. And it's somewhat driven by the confusion created by pictures of condos in Salem instead of the full use of the DPA of Salem as a port. And now we seem to be changing that with the soon to be released request for interest for the site. And so that's great. But there's been a lack of attention to detail. We don't know the geotechnical info where we should know. We haven't engaged directly with players in the industry the way we should have. CEC is trying very hard to get their north of Boston port analysis done. It got slowed down because Jade Borkland got hired away by Avangrid Renewables that owns the Vineyard Wind project and a bunch of others. And now he's the director of port and port implementation. So that's a big plus for us because he really likes Salem and thinks that it's a big advantage. So that has to trickle out. But in the meantime, it's really a political effort. It's getting all of the legislators in our region up to speed, educated, and feeling like the support is behind them from a constituent standpoint. And, I suggested today in conversation with Senator Lovely that I think it'd be a good idea to pull a coalition together and get a large briefing and get everybody up to speed and cross-pollinate our thoughts on the North Shore ports of how we work together to build a little bit more, gravitas around what all the ports bring, what Salem brings, what Gloucester brings, what maybe Lynn brings, and combine it. And the other big thing is that, now that Vineyard Wind has selected the GE turbines, GE is awake. We talked to GE 6 months ago, and they said, nothing's going on in Massachusetts. The permits aren't moving federally. Nothing's really happening at the state level. So GE has their attentions in offshore wind in Europe and China and other places that are doing it. And when things change, then we'll reconnect. So we've reconnected, and they've said, first question, okay, what's the load bearing capacity in Salem? We're like, oh, we don't know yet. But we need, so it's the same thing, but people are looking at it differently. And I think that's what's really important. And timing wise, we just got to stay active. And we have to get more in the press, more conversations with more politicians, with federal politicians about, hey, this part of Massachusetts adds huge value and assets to the offshore wind industry, and we want it out there. So we're getting there, but we are behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing, Bob, that you mentioned the request for interest. And so I think we can share with that because that was in the public meeting today as part of the Salem Harbor Port Authority that Footprint is putting out a request for interest and, regarding, trying to find out offshore wind developers that might be interested in the Footprint site specifically. They have asked for some input on that, which is great. And I think that, one of the things that I'm sure Bob has in there and we're kind of talking around it is, there aren't a lot of specifics as to what the site itself offers. And so it kind of leaves developers a little questioning, I'm sure. So
that's why we really need the CEC to finish up their work and get this, revised, updated report out. And I talked to Bruce Carlisle a couple of days ago, and they're trying to get it done. They are trying to get it done.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. Bob Myers, you had your hand up. Did you want to talk? Sorry.
Hi, yeah, this is Bob Myers from Gloucester. Just wanted to put out a couple brief notes. Met a couple of times with a company from Nova Scotia called Assured, and they're working on some solutions to help with lobster where you don't have ropes that are buoys up to the surface all the time for right whales, which is tangential to what we're concerned about here. I know we all care about that, but in terms of offshore wind, but it turns out that there's a bit of a tie-in there. And that is that once you put the electronics necessary to do any sort of ropeless or type technology, you have location technology, things like the Apple AirTags that are now out, but think of them as acoustics. And at some point, one of the things that we really want to do is to get fishers to come on board, because they're concerned about territory being taken by the offshore wind farms. And so where this ties together, and I'm trying to work up a presentation about it based on what Assured has shared with me, is that when you have the electronics in it, you have location electronics, and you begin to fish more precisely. And that's the sort of thing that's going to be needed if you're going to be fishing out around the OSW turbines. So you can't just put up a buoy at some point and expect it straight down is where your trap is, because the wind and tide and where the tide is and how fast it's flowing will influence the angle of that. So you don't really know. So you have to fish a much wider diameter around any obstructions. Whereas when you have 10 to 20 meter, no more imprecision, you can fish in places where there are more obstructions and tower anchors and that sort of stuff. Those farms, those fields are going to be part of that. So it seems to me that there's something that we can really help the fisher people to come on board with this and see this whole offshore wind effort as something that is going to benefit them and bring them forward. And the last point I would put out is Assured has mentioned that the European fishing industry has not seen problems with offshore wind. Their fishing industry has been going just as well without any sort of disruption. So I think it's doable, and I think there's things coming together with the right whales and the electronics going in, and it's very, very early days on it, but it's something that I can visualize a way through the thicket that's going to help our fishing industry as well, and help it to be even benefited perhaps by having these underwater platforms that are attracting fish and that are not causing a problem to them. Thank you.
I'm really glad you spoke up about that, Bob, and I appreciate your sharing the link to the Assured website. Maybe you might put that in the chat, Bob, so other people could put the website link in the chat so that other folks could go
Sure.
and take a look at that technology. Because when we first started talking about offshore wind, and this is not a new thing for SAFE, we've been talking about offshore wind for a very long time. And I have to give credit to Ted Warren, who's on this call, because I remember a SAFE meeting probably, I don't know, someplace, I can go back in the archive and find it, but someplace around over 10 years ago, when the state first had those parcels of land and that were available for potential offshore wind development. And Ted looked at it and said, well, this is what we could do. We could put a little wind farm out here. And we knew right away that it was too close to Marblehead, because they were objecting to one single land-based wind turbine at Winter Island. But I think even more to the point is that I started talking to the people in Gloucester, and the fishing industry in Gloucester said to me, one woman said to me very clearly at the outset of our conversation, and she was interested in the fishing community, and she said, Pat, what do you think's just about your wanting to put power plants out in the ocean when the ocean for years has been our source, or the source of our livelihood? And I thought, first of all, I never thought about a power plant out in the ocean, which is how maybe some of the fisher people, thank you, Bob, for that term, that non-sexist term, fisher people. But they were certainly looking at that, and the technology that you're exploring, which brings us into a new way of fishing, or brings them into a new way of fishing, I think might be part of, might be a solution here. And I agree that one of the things that should happen is that the industry, the folks, for instance, in Gloucester, who are in this fishing industry, should not be the ones paying for it. We should be looking at funding to help them support the transitioning to this kind of technology. So thank you for that.
I agree.
And we look forward to hearing more from you about this, Bob.
You bet. I put the link to Assured in the chat.
Okay, great. I see Bill McHugh has his hand up. Got to unmute, Bill. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to just address the SAFE Coalition here. I want to echo Bob Blair's sentiments as far as everything he said is spot on. I also just want to comment on the likelihood of the work that would need to be done to the pier to meet the geotech requirements. And it's very likely that the fortification would happen at the quay wall area, because as Cindy originally or previously indicated, the site has been well compacted by not just coal, but by oil tanks. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, as we educate our politicians, our local politicians and our state legislature, we need to impress upon them the timeline is now. We don't really have, it's not 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years out. We really need to make them aware that if this site was, if we had the red carpet out right now for wind energy, we'd have people signing on board right now. I really believe that. So I just want to make that point. And as we reach out to our different contacts, we need to educate them, and we need to make them all aware that the time is now. Thank you.
Agreed, Bill. So we're getting pretty late now, so I want to just make sure that we can have an opportunity to close out. There's some great kind of comments going back and forth in the chat. Specifically, even if we don't address climate change with things like renewables and offshore wind, we won't have the lobsters to be going and lobstering because they continue to go north, farther north and farther north. But I think the one other thing I just want to make sure I ask specifically is that SAFE has been contemplating whether we try to have some folks come in and talk about the financial aspects of economic investment in the port, or things of that nature, or if there are other things that people feel really strongly that they would like to have different speakers or different people come in to educate us further on. And so I just want to make sure that we ask that question, because we're open to that, but we want to also make sure that we're providing what our members and community are most interested in. So if there's anything specific that people really want to hear more about, the notes that I took right now are, understanding better about the jobs in Salem, and the different types of roles and what those jobs are, and the timing for kind of what that may look like into the future, what the considering kind of how fishing or other activities are or are not impacted around wind turbines. I know there was a comment, I believe by Maria, that she was under the impression that in Europe they don't allow any fishing near the offshore turbines themselves. And so I think that there's different activities that are happening and different permitting that happens. And I know that certainly for Vineyard Wind, they've worked pretty closely, or they're trying to work pretty closely with the fishermen, but there's always kind of give and take, and often nothing is perfect either, right? So I think that everybody's trying to work hard to make sure that those things happen as best as possible. And then just you know, really just continuing to push our elected officials to understand that we're out here, that we're interested, and that we want to see this happen as soon as possible. And we need to get this going because other ports absolutely are getting developed up and down the seaboard. And this is an opportunity that we might miss out on a little bit if we don't really get going. But hopefully, you know, there's still, you know, there are plenty of opportunities. And so, you know, we still want to make sure that we're keeping our eye out for any of the opportunities that we have.
I think I want to respond to a comment. I think what Jeff Cohen put it, and a couple of other people have also put it, that maybe talking to, and now I just see it come up again from 350 Mass North Shore, Jim, maybe getting Seth Moulton to speak to our group about what asking him, you know, get it on his radar and ask him to talk to us about what his position is with the offshore wind industry, and try to motivate him by showing that there is enormous interest right in the very town where he has his office and where he lives. And, you know, we want to hear from you, Seth Moulton, about what you could do for us as our representative. I think that's so. And we might even think about going bigger and asking Senator Markey and Senator Warren to speak as well. It would be amazing to have a larger New England delegation speak about this. And this might be something that we propose to New England for offshore wind, that, you know, that has more heavy hitters, players. SAFE is there, and we're there with very prestigious groups, environmental groups like ELM, Environmental League of Massachusetts, and Sierra Club, and Conservation Law Foundation. And Salem is there for a reason. I asked, why are you inviting Salem to be part of this New England for Offshore Wind Coalition? We're not the Sierra Club, we're not CLF. And they're like, you're a grassroots organization that really cares about the environment, that really cares about environmental justice, that has a port that could potentially be used for offshore wind. And that's why we want SAFE at the table. So we're very happy to be there at the table. We're sort of one of the grassroots groups that's there. But the suggestions that are coming in are great. And it looks as if we should be going for those politicos and asking them to speak. And to Bob Maher's point, maybe we should be looking at our sister city on the North Shore, Gloucester, and thinking about somebody to talk about positive aspects of this for the fishing industry, and then maybe here's some of the negative aspects, because no matter what wind forum I go to on Zoom, there inevitably is someone from the offshore wind industry, from the fishing industry rather, who has some problem with what's there with offshore wind. So I think that the building political will is going to be up there in our top priority, and also thinking about the fishing industry, but other industries as well. So jobs is really resonating for people. I can see that.
I want to add just a couple more thoughts on other ports like the Port of Gloucester. You know, the Port of Gloucester has a port infrastructure that is derelict at best. You know, at one time, Gloucester was the largest port for imported frozen seafood in America, and it all came by ship, and it landed in the cold storage freezers. And there has not been a cargo vessel in the Port of Gloucester for, I don't know, 10 years, maybe more. And those facilities, which are still there, are completely unutilized. And they're unutilized because there's no business. Well, if Salem gets established as a viable offshore wind port, it will spill over because there'll be vessels looking to be nearby Salem that will house themselves in the Port of Gloucester, that will create more jobs. And that this sort of ripple effect will extend, you know, around the region, but Gloucester particularly. And as far as the fishing industry itself goes, having been through this a few times with when the hub line gas line came through and when the two offshore LNG terminals got built in Massachusetts Bay, a lot of resources got directed into the fishing industry to help them with their needs. And they can expect more of that to happen and should be rightly at the table. And whether it's things like this technology that can help them fish or just some retraining and more job opportunities, there is benefit. And I also think that when it comes to the actual environment of the fishery itself, taking some areas out of fishing creates a haven for fish breeding. And that it may be, and I think this has been shown in some other places, particularly in and around the oil platforms down in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of fish thrive as a result of there being small areas where there is no fishing, because then the bottom's not being disturbed and the ecology of what the fish need is there. And this happened back years ago when they shut down scalloping on George's Bank for a long time. When they went back and finally opened it, there were more scallops than they knew what to do with, and they were huge and plentiful. And so, you know, it has happened where sometimes closures, they seem like this is really bad for fishing, but in the long run, it could be great for fishing, because you're going to have sanctuaries where fish will breed and then repopulate the larger area. And that's my my opinion, but I think it's based in experience and fact. And so I would be encouraged that the fishing industry should be an active participant in all the conversations. And I think the wind industry is expecting that they will be.
Agreed. So just to kind of slowly close us out here, you know, we said as at the beginning here, it is introductory. We want folks to continue to engage. There's multiple ways to do that. We'd encourage you to attend the public meetings, particularly the Salem Harbor Planning and the Salem Port Authority meetings when those are available. You can find those on salem.com. New England for Offshore, and the next slide gives you that link, and I also put it in the chat. And SAFE will continue to provide information out and continue to have meetings as well. Make your voices heard. It's not all about the South Shore. We want to continue to support them, because the more they go forward, the more everything else can. But we need to make sure people realize we're here and we're interested. And so the more we can do that, we want to keep our options open at that Salem Power Plant site. And then, you know, continue to ask questions and get our voices heard. With that, I just want to thank everyone for attending. And again, encourage you to visit newenglandforoffshorewind.org. There's a lot of really great resources there. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Our next SAFE meeting, we're planning to do one on mapping the gas leaks in Salem on June 3rd, and we are going to shift the time from 6:30 up to 7. So hopefully that'll be okay with folks. And if you are interested, if you're not already on our listserv or already on our email, email to salemsafe@gmail.com, and you can learn more generally, or ask to join the Offshore Wind Interest Group, and follow us on salemsafe.org, Facebook, Twitter, all of those wonderful things, as well as this recording will be up on our YouTube channel as well. So with that, Pat, do you want to say any closing words?
I just wanted to say that we'll send that link out to everybody on our listserv, and those of you who want to go back and take a look at it, think about it. I'll also remember to copy the chat so we can perhaps send out the chat as well to people, because there are a lot of great resources that people have put in the chat, and I think that's something we'll definitely do. Also, if a thought comes to your mind about a great speaker, a great topic in relationship to offshore wind, please email us at salemsafe@gmail.com, and we'll try to pursue it. But we definitely, I heard loud and clear from a lot of agreement that we should be looking to get Seth Moulton to speak to us about this and think about how this can play into the picture about energy, and particularly how Salem could be a beneficiary of the huge infrastructure bill that he and his colleagues are in the House supported. So thank you for coming, and Cindy, thank you. It's always great having a little conversation with you. And we're all learning our way, and we're grateful to folks like Bob Blair, who has been for years involved in the shipping industry and has lots of connections with lots of politicos and with the wind industry entities, and we'll continue to look for other suggestions. So thanks a lot. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks all. Good night.
Night.
Thank you. Keep us posted.